She graduated from UC Davis, a local girl, done good. She's got her master's in sensory and has been in the sensory group at the NFL for at least 13 years. In her role, she designs and implements objective sensory analysis projects, leads the sensory shelf life program, and manages large integrated shelf life studies. The sensory shelf life program at the NFL is uniquely suited to track quality changes in shelf-stable and frozen foods over time. When she's not enjoying sensory, she does a few other things you see there: horseback riding, reading, spending time with her family. There's her contact information. You'll be able to see that a little bit later. I need to stop sharing my screen and let Regan share hers.
Okay. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm very happy to be here and speak to all of you today about sensory shelf life evaluation. So today we're going to go over a few topics. Bruce had briefly brought that screen up about what I'm going to be speaking about. But basically we're going to start with, what is shelf life evaluation? Some design considerations you should take when planning a thoughtful study in shelf life. And then we're going to kind of touch into, what is sensory evaluation? A lot of people have different concepts of what sensory is, how it should be conducted. So we'll kind of give some general background on what sensory is, what we do here at the National Food Lab and how we support our shelf life studies with sensory. And then I'm going to follow this up with some case studies on some shelf life projects that we've done in the past that kind of highlight some of the techniques and considerations that we touched on earlier in the presentation. And then at the end, we'll have time for questions if anybody wants to ask anything. So I know that, before I start, there's some confusion in the industry, maybe even locally, about where the National Food Lab is today. I know we've kind of had an interesting history in the past few years, but the National Food Lab is part of a larger global network. Several years ago, we were kind of our own standalone entity. We were the National Food Lab. We were based in Dublin, and then we moved to Livermore, California. We were acquired by a group called Safe Food Holdings, and they acquired 3 different companies. So the National Food Lab being one of them. They also acquired Food Perspectives in Minnesota, which was a consumer research firm. And they acquired IFN, so International Food Network. They were a product development firm located in New York and Florida. So these were brought all under one roof. We were acquired by Covance. Covance is a drug and pharmaceutical company. They created a food spin-off that they maintained for only a few years before that then sold to, and so Eurofins is a European food testing company. They're based in Belgium. So they have a large laboratory network in the US, Europe, Asia, across the globe. So we are their food product design group. So within the Eurofins system, we owned by Eurofins. We've been able to now retain the name the National Food Lab. So the National Food Lab includes this site here in California, the Minnesota, New York, and Naples, Florida site. So because we are now part of the Eurofins system, we now have a global network of over 15 owned locations, and we can conduct sensory and consumer testing now across the globe. What's unique about this Livermore location, however, is we are the only site in North America within the Eurofins system that has a trained descriptive panel. So when I talk about sensory support of shelf life and using panelists, all of this work is conducted here in Livermore, California. We do outsource a lot of work to some of these other labs to support our business here. So it's nice having a global network of partners that we can collaborate with. So let's get into it. Sensory shelf life. What is that? What does that mean? So sensory shelf life. Sensory is uniquely qualified and uniquely suited to support the claim that you're going to put on a package to say how long your product lasts for, especially for shelf stable or frozen foods. So shelf stable and frozen foods are safe. The issue that a consumer might encounter at the end of a product shelf life would be primarily quality. They don't like how it tastes, or it doesn't look like what they think it should look like. Everything has been processed and packaged and is safe for consumption. So we're not worried about anybody getting sick at the end of our shelf life. So sensory is used to describe these changes in quality over time. So the approach that we use here at the NFL is a holistic approach. We design, manage, and execute these shelf life studies from beginning to end. And these shelf life studies are, they're complex studies. They are something that takes quite a bit of planning on the front end to execute and gain meaningful data across time so we can set an accurate shelf life. So there's, steps that we want to take before we set these up. We want to assess potential modes of failure. What is going to drive these changes in our product? So we want to be cognizant of what is going to be our mode of failure so we can apply the best tool to measure that mode of failure. So we're able to incorporate different measures across different disciplines. Again, mostly for these shelf stable and frozen products, sensory is probably the largest tool that we're going to use to measure for these changes. But we also can include microbiological, chemistry, and physical measurements to support the work that sensory will do. There's different methodologies we can also apply. We have accelerated and full-term studies. So, maybe we're just doing a short, brief study that requires only some accelerated time points. To full term, we're going to take this to the end of the shelf life to validate what we've learned. We also can conduct statistical modeling. So we do have a statistics team in-house. So we are able to conduct modeling and statistical analysis on these studies if required by the client. And also very important to shelf life studies, we can't forget, is our holding chambers. So we are very fortunate here. We've got over 25 units that we are able to set at different temperatures, from sub-zero temperatures to humidity controls to accelerated heat temperatures, pretty much anything in between. So we are able to kind of mimic different conditions, different abuse requirements, just depending on the product. So at the NFL, we work with our clients and we say, okay, what's our product? What are potential modes of failure? What kind of tools are we going to use to measure these modes of failure to get the best output and data? How are we going to measure this? And what temperatures are we going to put our products in? So a couple different factors that go into these studies. So why conduct a shelf life at all? Again, as I mentioned earlier, for shelf-stable products, sensory really is the tool that measures changes in quality. So sensory will measure changes in flavor, changes in aroma, changes in texture. So things that are not, again, going to hurt a consumer, but they might make a consumer think twice about consuming that product again. They might say, yuck, I don't like this, and take a look at the date on your package. I don't think I'm going to buy this again, or I'm going to throw this out. So we are able to provide data to our clients and say, hey, this is where your product is changing, this is how much it's changing, and this is why or where it's changing, which would allow them to make a business decision on how much change in quality are they willing to allow their consumers to experience based upon these results. So some clients are, very risk averse. They don't want their consumers to see any change in their product, where others might say, hey, we don't mind if, they experience a little oxidation in our potato chip, or, well, we don't really seem to mind if consumers see a little bit of change in texture in our cookies. So the information we provide to them, allows them to make that decision. And sometimes that might be based upon, their supply chain, manufacturing. How long does this product sit in a grocery store before it's purchased? So all this information goes into that decision of ultimately in setting shelf life. So underneath, I've got a few bullet points here that kind of give some specific examples as to why we would conduct a shelf life test. Pretty obvious one is a new formulation or ingredient change. If you have say a mayonnaise and you change the preservative system in it, maybe it's a cost-saving measure, maybe there's some new preservative on the market that's supposed to extend shelf life by 6 months. It's a magical thing. We would go ahead and shelf life test that and make sure that, hey, is this matching our current shelf life, and is it truly extending the shelf life of our product? So, does it have a negative or a positive impact on what our product currently is? New packaging. So perhaps you've got a cookie and we've been finding we have complaints about staling. So we take a look at available packaging out in the industry and say, hey, we found something that's got a better moisture barrier. So we're going to package our cookie with this new package and see if it extends the shelf life. Is it worth the investment to spend more money on this better package, or does it not really change the texture of our cookie in the end? So new packaging would be something that we would test for that too. A lot of consumers want to see their product as well. So, some manufacturers are moving to packages that have windows in them, which allows light to pass through. And we know that light oxidizes products. So, if we put a big, huge window on our package, how does that affect the product in it? Does it turn our product brown much faster? Validation of an existing shelf life. So we might have a shelf life on our product. Perhaps our co-man suggested this. Maybe we want to have some more leeway in our existing shelf life. Maybe we have a stamped shelf life of 9 months, and we want to just see if we can get it to 12 months. So if food safety is not an issue and we don't have any, label claims on nutritional values, maybe we can push that shelf life out by 3-4 months. So we would just, put our package, our product into a shelf life study and validate that what we've got on there is truly the shelf life. Maybe we're getting customer complaints. We even have some clients come to us and say, we don't really know why this date is on here, but we want to make sure it's correct. So we would help them out with that. Determine a new or novel product. That's kind of an easy one. If you've never developed a product before, if there's nothing out on the market and we have no idea, we would put that under shelf life studies to kind of flesh that out. Abuse in supply chain. This is something that's become kind of a hot topic around here lately. When product is produced, it's under some sort of control on how it's handled, temperature, where it's stored. But once that product leaves a manufacturing facility and gets put into that supply chain and gets sent to a distribution warehouse, it's kind of hard to keep track of what's happening to your product. So, it might be sent on a truck across Alaska and it goes through some frozen cycling temperatures, or it might sit in a distribution warehouse in Texas for 2 months and cycle between extreme heat and humidity. And this is all before our product even gets to the grocery store and your consumer picks it up and purchases it. So we have a lot of interest recently on understanding, we know our product goes through this type of abuse. What does that abuse do to our product from a quality standpoint? How does it impact what the consumer is then experiencing once they pick it up? So we know it tastes like fresh strawberry when it leaves the manufacturer, but what does it really taste like when it gets to the store, and how does that ultimately impact our end date on shelf life? Change in processing conditions. If you've got a new mixer, if you move your plant from one state to another. Retailer compliance is another one that we see fairly often. Some retailers require shelf life testing, validation of shelf life testing before they'll stock a product on a shelf. So they kind of want to see that checkbox. And then also we have safe quality food certification. So some manufacturers need to go through this program to prove that their product is safe. There's different levels of safe quality food certification to achieve. Quality would be level 3, and part of that level 3 certification includes quality and shelf life testing. So if you've got a product and you say, hey, I need to determine shelf life, the first step is, why am I doing this? You know, what is the driver behind determining my shelf life? And this will ultimately then help us decide what other tools we apply downstream as we design our shelf life study. So different modes of failure, different considerations. So we've established that we are conducting a shelf life study because of one of the factors that we described in the previous slide. So now that we know that we're conducting the study and we have a reason to do it, it's it's important to decide, okay, well, what are our modes of failure? What am I potentially measuring for? So, as I've reiterated several times already, frozen and shelf-stable products are mainly driven by changes in quality. Again, they're food safe. They're not going to hurt our clients, our customers. So, what are we tracking when I talk about quality? What is it about quality that we're measuring? So we have on the right-hand side some common sensory off notes. So as your product ages over time, we might see some of these things happen to that product. One of them might be development of off notes. Perhaps you've got an applesauce, and then over time, we might start to develop some off notes that consumers might find off-putting. Maybe we're getting some rotten apple flavor. Maybe we've got a nut bar that starts to develop rancidity notes. And on the right-hand side, we've got this little box about oxidation and rancidity. So we found that oxidation is a progression over time. If you purchase a bottle of, say, canola oil fresh from the grocery store and you smell it or taste it, it shouldn't really have much of an aroma or flavor. It's got a little bit of something, but over time, as this product ages and starts to oxidize, it starts to develop some of these off notes. So it might start to taste a little stale. You might start to get a little wet cardboard flavor. As it oxidizes even more, maybe it becomes painty. When it becomes really rancid, your consumer might be picking up like a fishy note. So depending on the composition of the product, oxidation might be something that we want to really focus on. If we're looking at an oil, if we're looking at a supplement, or we've got a granola bar that has lots of nuts in it. So rancidity would be tied to fats. Changes in color, the human perception of foods and if they're going to like it or eat it is strongly tied to vision. You look at something, you're like, wow, that looks really appealing. I want to eat it. So if you're producing a pink cookie, a pink strawberry cookie, if I take it out of the package and I'm expecting pink and I see brown, I might be a little bit disappointed. So tracking changes in color, changes in texture. Texture is something that's really hard to measure in the lab. So this is kind of an important one for things like chips, popcorn, even baby food, beverages, really anything. The changes in viscosity, the mouthfeel, very important. And loss of desirable flavors. If you open up your applesauce and expect it to taste like apples and it doesn't, you're going to be disappointed. So tracking these gradual losses of desirable flavors and changes of texture and development of off notes over time. So using sensory analysis and trained panelists, we can track these changes with human perception and provide this information to our clients to say, hey, your product looks good up until this point, and then maybe after several months we start to see changes that might not be so good for consumer experience. So some other things to take into consideration are analytical and microbiological measurements. In terms of micro testing, we certainly do include these regularly on our shelf life studies. They're not absolutely necessary. Sometimes they are, it just depends on the product. But we typically might test for some spoilage organism, yeast and mold or lactics, nothing that's harmful. We wouldn't test for, say, listeria at each time point or E. coli. If we do conduct refrigerated shelf life studies, which occasion we do. Micro testing always gets done first before anything is tasted, and usually is a driver of failure for those types of studies. But in terms of chemistry and physical measurements, these are just a few of the ones that we typically do here. We might measure color using Hunter's LAB. We can track moisture, viscosity, Brix, track sweetness, pH, TA, and also some GCMS work. We have a GC lab in Madison that we use to help with our shelf life studies as well. An interesting point, and one that I would like to highlight here, is that while we do find that having these physical and chemistry measurements are helpful, they might be something that the client specifically requested. We found that sensory data is a extremely useful tool in interpreting these analytical results or physical measurements. You might say, oh, the moisture on my cracker is decreasing. Well, it could be decreasing, but is there a human perception in moisture? So is that a meaningful decrease in your moisture measurement? Oftentimes we might have clients come to us and say, hey, we use your GC lab and we're getting a peak in our juice. It looks like the juice is, scalping some packaging flavor, and we're picking up some plastic notes, analytically at least, in our juice from the package. Well, you might get this peak, but presented it to the trained panel. Can they actually taste it? Is this something to be worried about? So oftentimes with these frozen and shelf stable products, while the chemistry and physical measurements are useful, it's also very helpful to relate that back to the actual human. So can they perceive these changes in moisture? Can they actually visually see these changes in color that your instrument is reading? We do occasionally conduct rancidity measurements. This is a word of caution. This is always a super popular question that people ask us when we're designing these shelf life studies. A lot of people want to test for, say, peroxide value or pianicidine, or, there's a host of rancidity measurements that you can conduct. But over the years, I've been doing this for, 14 or so years. We have yet to establish a strong connection or even a valid connection between rancidity measurements and sensory perception of oxidation. So I know, people are looking for a magic bullet to say, hey, I've got this spike in these rancidity measurements. That's going to determine my shelf life because my product is oxidized. Well, not necessarily. We might have a spike in these measurements, but when I present it to our panelists, you can't taste anything. It does not taste rancid. Other times the product tastes incredibly rancid. It's very painty and fishy, and there's no peroxide value or no pianicidine value worth reporting. So a word of caution when trying to use rancidity as a measure of shelf life. We always strongly recommend that we use sensory panelists to measure oxidation. They're much more reliable in the perception of that rather than these measurements. And lastly, for frozen and shelf-stable products, nutritional packaging or labeling can actually set your shelf life priority. So if you have a fortified product, say baby food or a gummy, a nutritional gummy, if your label claim doesn't match what's actually in that product, that will set your shelf life. So your product could taste great, but if you say you've got 100 milligrams of vitamin C, on your label, but you actually only have 50, well, that's your shelf life. So what's on your label claim should match your nutritional label. So that's one thing that can kind of trump all sensory data. So you're kind of bound by that. Okay. We've established why we're doing our sensory shelf life study. We've established, potential modes of failure, whether it's quality, any micro or analytical tests we need to include. So now let's talk about some storage conditions. So we know what we're doing, we know what we're testing for, so how are we going to store this product? So let's start with a control. So a lot of products have shelf lives ranging from, most shelf stable products I'd say on average are about a year. There are, exceptions to that rule. We've tested things as short as, say, 3 months up to 3 years, just depending on the product, how it's processed, how it's packaged. We always try to hold a control. So in a perfect world, we would have a fresh control delivered at, several time points over the course of the shelf life study. It's awfully hard sometimes to remember what a fresh product tasted like when you get to the end of a 3-year shelf life. So it's always great to have a control. Unfortunately, due to, product variability, availability, etc., we can't always have that drop-off service. So we make an exception here, and we would do either a deep freeze, we can freeze product, or refrigerate control. So if I'm doing a shelf life study on a frozen meal or frozen fish or something, perhaps I would then put a control at -50°C, so at a deep freeze condition. So I can pull that out and say, to the extent possible, I have tried to stop the clock on aging on this product. This is as close as I'm going to get to a fresh control, so that a year down the road we can say, this is what it looked like fresh, I'm saying that in air quotes, compared to how it's aged now. Maybe we've got some juice or something and we're doing a study on, we can freeze that, or perhaps we refrigerate instead. So we try to find some type of option to allow us to have a control. That being said, there are some products out there where we can't always have a control. We've done shelf life studies on, say, yogurt. We can't freeze yogurt. It changes the structure of the product, so it's no good. So sometimes we can't have a control. In that case, then we anchor back to our original description or our original intensity scores with the panel and use that going forward. So once we've established a control where we're going to put that, how are we going to store this for real-time or accelerated conditions? So of course we want to hold at typical or ambient storage. What is it doing in real life? So if we're hoping to achieve a year, we're going to want to store it under typical storage conditions, whether that's frozen or ambient, for up to a year. If the product is subjected to any type of cycling throughout its life cycle, we might want to incorporate that into our studies. So perhaps we've got an ice cream and we know it cycles a few times before it gets to the consumer, or we know that the consumer might inadvertently cycle it on their way home. So we can do some kind of freeze thaw or some type of elevated frozen cycling to throw in that kind of abuse to see what happens to our product. Humidity controls is another option we offer. If you've got product that potentially has a moisture barrier issue or is stored in the southeast, we can certainly replicate that. And accelerated testing. So we have a wide range of temperatures that we can accelerate our products at, kind of as a disaster check. We oftentimes have people come to us and say, hey, I've got this product and, can I put it at 200 degrees Fahrenheit and can you tell me what the shelf life is in 2 weeks? Unfortunately, we don't have a time machine. Accelerated testing is not really meant for that purpose. Accelerated testing is meant to be a disaster check. It gives you a kind of a quick sense of what your product may do in the future. We always stress that it's best to then hold your product under typical or ambient storage conditions so we can validate what's happening under that accelerated condition. Sometimes you might want to put a more conservative date on a product based on accelerated results if you've got to put something out there right away. And then once we start to get real-time or typical storage condition results back, we can push that shelf life date back on our product. Light exposure, we do have light boxes here. So if you've got that window in your applesauce, we can put stuff under light to see what happens. So we have a variety of different temperatures and storage conditions we can hold product at, and it's very important to understand your product before choosing a temperature to put your product at. So, if you've got something in a can and it's very robust, has a very long shelf life, you could probably be a little bit more abusive with it. We can accelerate it a little bit higher. It can be held longer. Compared to, say, a baby food puree that, maybe it doesn't have any preservatives and it's got a shorter shelf life and it's, you know, it's made with strawberries that we know the color changes very quickly in it. So you have to be very thoughtful in choosing these storage conditions to set up a good study design and get useful information. So, you know, we wouldn't want to put some, you know, delicate type product at a super abusive condition and end up just destroying our product in the end without gaining any useful information from it before it reaches the end of its accelerated shelf life. So we always want to be cognizant of you know, what the product is, how it's packaged, what that supply chain is, so that we can choose the best accelerated temperature, the best control, and the best endpoint so we can collect meaningful data. And shelf life study frequency. So we've established why we're doing it. We've established what kind of data we're collecting. We've decided on where we're going to store it. And then the final piece to this puzzle is how often are we going to take a look at it. So refrigerated products obviously would have a shorter shelf life than, say, you know, a can of vegetables. So we would look at those time points much more frequently over the course of its shelf life. Maybe it's only 2 weeks or a month. You know, if we've got that delicate pouched baby food, perhaps we look at that more frequently over a 6-month shelf life. So the frequency of testing usually will increase as we approach the end of our shelf life so we can capture meaningful data. We don't want to have big gaps in changes. We don't want to take a look at a product and, hey, it looks fine, we're not seeing any changes, and then we've waited too long and it's failed, or it's become, you know, very oxidized. So once we start getting to the point where we're thinking that we're going to start to see change or our product is going to fail, we want to probably test a little bit more frequently. The nice thing too about shelf life studies is that the schedules are very flexible and allow changes to be captured in real time. So we're able to modify if we need to. If we're seeing products change more rapidly, we can change our design. If they're changing more slowly, we can extend our design. So we are able to then capture what we need when we need it. So I missed this on the beginning of the slide, but I think we were going to do a poll, and I think I'm on it now. I think we were going to poll what people knew about sensory evaluation. I'm not sure if that worked out or not, but oh, there it is. I missed the first one, so apologies there. So this is a little poll that we thought would be fun to share. So I'm going to get into the sensory part of the discussion now. So now that we've established, you know, our design and what shelf life study is and what we should be considering when we design these studies, I'm going to kind of dive into what sensory evaluation is. So here's a poll about, you know, just how familiar are you with sensory evaluation? So kind of a fun thing. Okay, so we'll reveal the answers in a slide or two. Oh, there they are. Okay, so it looks like most people are either very familiar or have some experience. Great. Okay, so this, what I'm going to go through, most of you shouldn't come as a huge surprise. Okay. So definition of sensory evaluation. This is the NCIFT definition. So it's a scientific discipline used to measure the reaction of senses to food or any materials. So what I usually, you know, depending on the audience, what I like to stress here is that, you know, sensory is a legitimate science. You know, oftentimes people might think it's just, you know, a bunch of people sitting around having a party, tasting food. Not necessarily. So it is a scientific discipline. You can go to school from it, master's, a PhD, a bachelor's. It's a rigorous science that is used to measure the senses and involves, you know, statistical analysis and interpretation of those results. So there are two types of sensory testing. There's objective sensory and there's hedonic testing. All of these tools are applicable to our shelf life study. I will say that we primarily are objective tool on shelf life studies, although sometimes we use hedonic depending on, you know, the level of rigor client need. So objective sensory would be answering the question of what does a product taste like, where hedonic is answering the question of do consumers like it? So, you know, it's more opinion based. So this is just kind of a basic overview of what consumer testing is. So we might have that cookie, and we say, hey, we want to see if consumers like this or not. Are they noticing any difference? So we would recruit a bunch of people who are perhaps purchasers of this, or they like strawberry cookies, and have them come into our site. We'll give them the cookies and ask them some overall liking questions. Do you like the aroma? Do you like the flavor? And they answer questions on a 9-point scale from I like this extremely to I dislike this extremely. So we get their opinion, their perception of this product. And then using statistical analysis, we can then, run a data on this to say, hey, it looks like, of these 3 products that are in our shelf life study, it looks like prototype A is like the best. Even better than our current product, and more so than product B. So we don't really know anything about the product, the sensory characteristics of that product. We just know that consumers like prototype A. And again, this is a very basic slide about what consumer testing is. So here at our Livermore facility, this is where our trained panel is housed. We have a pool of about 40 highly trained panelists. So these panelists are used only for our objective sensory business. So we don't use, Carol in accounting and Bob from the pilot plant on their lunch break to come up here and taste for us. So we've got an average of about 5 years experience on these panelists. Some of them have been here, fewer than that. And then we do have a couple panelists who have been here for, 15, 20 plus years. So they're very experienced. All of the panelists are screened for their sensitivity, and they go through a rigorous training process before they're placed on the panel. Our panel leaders here are very experienced. They either have advanced degrees or they've got industry experience in product development. So this slide is just meant to highlight that, it's very professional here. We've got trained staff and trained panelists to conduct these studies, and they're very qualified. So how do you get onto this panel? As I mentioned, it's not Carol and Bob from accounting. So we typically go through this process every few years, just depending on our numbers of panels in the pool. But we usually start with a pool of names of about 300, and they're all from the local area, so they all live within 10 or 15 minutes of us. We typically start with about 200 to 300 names of people who are interested. We'll do some phone screening, so we'll call them up and make sure that they're available, they're interested, they're articulate, and then we'll invite about 100 of them back to do some screening. So we might give them some basic taste, maybe some group exercises. Based upon those results, we'll then screen out, the top 50 in terms of performance. They'll come back, they'll do some more difficult screening exercises, we'll do some interviews one-on-one with them, and then we'll ultimately whittle that pool of 300 people down to about 15. Once we have those 15 identified, they come in for at least 3 months worth of training, and during that training, we go through different product categories, we look at references, we look at different verbiage, terminology, how to use a scale, how to develop a lexicon. So they go through this training process before they're slowly integrated into the standing panel, and we conduct data collection with them. So this is just a kind of a fun slide about different things that we can conduct shelf life testing on with our trained panel. So basically anything that gives you a sensorial experience, we can collect data on, from a shelf life standpoint, whether it's health and beauty to food. So, if you've got a sunscreen, does it clump when you squeeze it out of the bottle? Or a hand lotion, does it still smell like roses after a year on your counter? So it really doesn't matter what the product is. You can conduct sensory and you can conduct shelf life testing on it. So this is, a bit wordy for a PowerPoint, I realize, but the point of this slide is to show that, using our sensory panelist and knowing the different criteria or things that go into setting up a shelf life study, we have different methods to collect data for our clients. So we've got, different levels of rigor here. We go from, on the far left, we have degree of difference, that is that is full descriptive. We've got lots of panelists. We do replications of data. We do statistical analysis. You know, that might be something suitable for a client that has a low tolerance for risk. Maybe they're making a change to one of their top selling products, so they want something with a lot of rigor. You know, it's a big, huge business decision for them. So, you know, we've got that option for them. And then some of the other options are smaller scale, just depending on the level of rigor that a client needs. Everything has got, you know, three trained panelists. It might be consensus. You know, maybe we only need a disaster check. So we've got different levels of data collection here to suit what clients need. So I've got a couple case studies here of real life scenarios that we've actually done. Thought they were kind of fun. So this one was a retail simulation. We've got a cookie supplier. They were concerned about how their product was abused during transport, and then whether that product could be held in a retail case for room temperature for up to 7 days. So these were pre-made cookies that were sold at, you know, at a retailer. So they're already made. So based upon what the client told us, we came up with this design. You know, we would cycle product, and then we would hold product out till 7 days and take a look at it. They wanted us to look at it daily, so we used a stage entry design. So we would pull product out of a reference storage, place it under 70, and slack them out for 7 days, so that when we presented it to the panelists, they could take a look at everything at once and made them a bit more sensitive. There we go. So what we found was over time, the cookies were changing a bit more than the supplier thought they were. We collected some narrative descriptive data. So this is qualitative data, so it's all descriptions. I condensed this because the slide was too small, but we basically found that after 7 days, we were finding some significant differences here in texture and flavor of the cookie. So we ultimately recommended to the supplier that their product only be stored in a retail case for 5 days and not 7 days. So taking this information, they could then make a business decision on whether or not they wanted to change their shelf life. Another case study here, we did this with pouched jalapeno peppers. So there was a pepper manufacturer. He was investigating different films. So they had different thicknesses. Definitely different costs between those films as well. So we evaluated these peppers, placed into these pouches, they were all the same peppers, and held them over time. And this was a different data collection method that we used. This was still consensus, so no stats, but we used quantitative data collection. So at the initial evaluation, we came up with this list of attributes to describe the peppers, and then we tracked their intensity and the changes in these attributes over time. And we could certainly add things that we needed as we saw fit. But what we found over time was that there was definitely a difference in these pouches. We tracked off flavors, among other things. So based upon this information, we were able to provide to the retailer or to the pepper manufacturer that it looks like pouch C was proving to be the worst performing pouch, and pouch A performed the best. So the accelerated study at 100 degrees kind of gave us a read ahead of time of our real time. So it gave us a kind of a snapshot of the future. And we were able to validate at 70 that pouch A was indeed the best way to go. So degree of difference testing, this is our quantitative data collection where we're going to use replications and panelists and statistical analysis. So comparing against a control and conducting statistics against it to see if there's a significant difference in attributes. So case study 3 here, we did pasta sauce. A few years ago, Prop 65 was a kind of a hot topic, and manufacturers wanted to take BPA out of their packaging. So we had somebody come to us and say, hey, we want to test our pasta sauces packaged in jars with and without BPA tests or BPA over time. So at each time point, we conducted full quantitative descriptive analysis. You know, is there a difference between the control package and the new package? We also conducted testing for BPA in both of those package and also in the package integrity itself. So our pilot plant helped us out, and the GMA, the grocery manufacturer, also did some analysis for us on the lids. Overall results that we found for sauce A, our test package actually performed comparable or better to the current package that our product was in. So from a sensory standpoint, the analytical and the physical data. Sauce B, however, sensory showed a downside in the new package, and the physical data also showed a downside. So the combination of sensory, analytical, and physical data then allowed the sauce manufacturer to make a better decision about, do I need to change my shelf life, or do I need to find a new package for my product? We are also able to do predictive modeling here. A lot of times people ask us, hey, can I get an acceleration rate? So using statistical analysis and Arrhenius modeling, we can do that. They're a bit larger designs, but we are able to then come up with an equation that says, based upon our mode of failure and our endpoint, we can say, hey, if we plug in a time and temperature, we can tell you what that rate of acceleration is. And if your product will fail or still be okay after we put in those unknown values. And then what about consumers? So if our clients have the need and they are concerned about risk, we can certainly present products to consumers over time. So we might use results from descriptive evaluations to indicate when we can present to consumers, and then we would give to consumers and say, hey, we're starting to see changes with our panel. Can we put to consumers, and do they validate that? Are they okay with the changes that we're seeing? So another tool to help make a decision on whether or not we can, how we set our shelf life. So I'm about running out of time here, so I'm going to speed through these. But at the NFL, we've got all these different tools at our fingertips. We have sensory, we have consumer, we've got product and process development. So, we're able to collaborate with a number of scientists on setting up a design. We can, develop a product from beginning to end and conduct shelf life testing on that. And also if we encounter a problem in midstream in our shelf life study, we have the resources to say, hey, how do we fix this? Maybe we need to go to our product development team or our process team and make suggestions and recommendations to the product to help achieve the shelf life our clients need. Lastly, there's been some interest in, how we're testing, getting around COVID. Obviously, people who don't need to be in the building aren't here. We're following CDC guidelines. But where possible, our trained panelists are testing products at home. So we're sending products home with panels, and much like this, we're conducting orientations and data collection systems, over teleconferencing or through online data collection portals. So limiting contact, everything's clean and sanitary, but, doing the best we can. So I think I'm out of time, so I will leave it to questions. I think I'm only about 2 minutes over. So Elise, I think that's it.
Regan, it's Bruce. Thank you so much.
Oh, Bruce, yes, thank you.
A lot of good information, and a lot of questions came in.
Oh, good. Okay.
I hope you're ready. I'm going to take one that I liked really early on. By the way, you might want to leave that screen or that last slide up so people can have your address. But the first question goes to bias. So when you're creating a sensory evaluation form, how do you guide evaluators to notice a certain attribute, say a flavor, without introducing too much bias? Is it better to leave the question more open-ended and see if they pick it up, or how do you deal with that?
So as the, leading the experiment and knowing what you know on the back end, it's very easy to bias your panelists. And as soon as you present an idea to them, a lot of times they jump on that. So, if you're smelling something and you're like, gosh, I don't know what that is. If I say, oh, it smells like baby powder, they're immediately going to say, oh yeah, that does smell like baby powder. So, as a panel leader and leading these experiments, it's really important you want to guide the conversation so that you get meaningful data and, you're moving along in your study. But absolutely, you don't want to introduce bias. You don't want to sway the panel about finding attributes or intensities that they won't find themselves because you know too much, because you yourself are biased. So we always try and let the panelists kind of figure it out themselves. If they're not coming up with, say oxidation, I try not to present it to them. Sometimes on our ballot, we might put just a total off note and then let them describe it to us. Sometimes I might, if you put something on there like, rancidity or old musty, they might just dump automatically into those attributes because they can't quite put something there, or it biases them to look for something that may or may not be there. So we try and stay as neutral as possible and let the panelists do their job.
Sounds good. Most of the questions that came in were revolving around trained panelists versus consumer acceptance. I need to read a few of the questions so you get the gist.
Sure.
A trained panel is great to describe change, but should it be used for consumer acceptance? Do you use consumer panels for acceptance? And if so, how many on the panel? And then later, got another question about how many years of experience do you have on your expert panel, and the correlation between expert versus consumer panel. And one more here I wanted to get in. How is the baseline set for trained panelists with respect to actually performance in consumer testing? So it all wraps around trained versus consumer panels. You want to talk to that a little bit?
Sure. So we do occasionally use the consumers for shelf life studies. Most shelf life studies involve multiple time points and span years even. So from a cost standpoint, it's usually prohibitive to have consumers come in at every time point and taste these samples. It's just very expensive. We occasionally will have consumers come in. So we will have the trained panelists track these sensory changes over time. And you are correct, the panelists don't give an acceptance because they are trained panelists. So it's some key points that either the client designates or based upon what the panelist has provided to the client, they might say, hey, we want consumers to come in and see if they find this still to be acceptable. So we might conduct, depending again on the level of rigor, we might have 50 consumers come in. We might have 150 consumers come in where they're recruited, based upon, are they a user of this product? Are they within the demographic? Are they, purchasers of this category? So whatever those criteria may be, they would come in and we would then present these aged products to them or abused or, whatever we've done to them and say, do you still find this to be acceptable? Do you still like this total overall aroma? We might put in a control as well. The trained panel is not a consumer panel. There is a difference. So the consumers are just recruited from the outside. They are not trained. They're not, shown references, or, they're not a highly tuned instrument or repeatable instrument like we like to say. So they're just used for their acceptance and their opinion. Our trained panelists are not consumers either. I know sometimes trained panels might be a consumer group that comes in and trains. Our trained panelists are used on multiple projects, multiple categories. We use a universal line scale to measure our products. So there definitely is a distinction between the trained panel and that they provide feedback, either quantitative or qualitative, unbiased on these changes that are occurring in the product. And then the consumer is used to come in and say, yes, we find this acceptable. No, we don't find it acceptable. I don't like this. I find this flavor too strong. I wouldn't buy this. And if we could use them more regularly on shelf life studies, depending on a client's need, we certainly could and can do that. I hope that
Great.
answers the question.
I think you covered it. We're at time. So before I ask the last question, I want to thank all the participants for being on and enjoying the presentation. I need to thank Regan for presenting such a good talk on a well-attended talk. And I want to ask one last question to close with because it kind of intrigued me.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the first question asked. How do you do a frozen product accelerated shelf life test?
So that's a good question. So for an accelerated frozen shelf life, our typical storage would be everything that we store at is something a consumer normally has. So the typical storage condition for that would be like a home freezer, so 0 Fahrenheit. Our controls are usually at some sub-zero temperature, and then we accelerate at usually about 15 Fahrenheit, give or take. So the product is still frozen, so it's still safe. It hasn't been defrosted, but it is an abusive frozen temperature, and we do find that it does quite a good job of driving changes quickly, or more quickly than at typical frozen storage conditions. So yeah, good question.
Interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Regan, if you're available, I think what we'll try to do is ask you to answer some of these questions separately, and we'll send those answers out with the recording.
Yeah, sounds good.
So with that, thank you to everyone. We really appreciate your time, and we look forward to seeing you on our next Northern California IFT webinar. Thanks again.
Thank you.